Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to a special fireside chat with former Chief Judge Paul Michel. Judge Michel was the former Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, which is perhaps best known as the nation's patent court. But he's also done many other spectacular things throughout his career. Typically, we have a lengthy introduction of our speaker, but since this is a session that's done as part of our Profiles in Leadership series, where we interview distinguished individuals and talk about their lives and leadership lessons that they have, I'm going to cut short the introduction because we'll be talking about it all throughout the next hour, and we're going to save time also for questions or comments from all of you in the room. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to also recognize my co-moderator today, Dean Conway, no stranger to any of you here. We've now done this a couple of times, and it's always been fun tag teaming with Dean Conway because you never know what questions she might ask, but they're always good questions. So having now worked the room for you, Dean Conway, I will leave you to ask the first question of our guest today.
Thank you so much, and everyone, thank you for attending. And one thing I want to share with you is that this is one example of life intersecting in really amazing ways. So I never had the privilege as a young attorney to be in direct contact with Judge Michel. That said, I was in indirect contact with him through people I knew, particularly individuals who I served with in the United States Army. And so Judge Michel was in direct contact with friends of mine who I served with, particularly two individuals, a gentleman named Scott McCaleb, who's a partner at a big firm right now, and then another colleague, Catherine White, who teaches at Wayne State. So our colleague, former Dean Bob Ackerman, knows her well, but she's also a general now in the Army. And they intersected directly with Judge Michel. So when Judge Michel and I finally did get connected through Professor Darrell Lim, it was almost as if we knew about one another because of these connections. And that made our meeting so much more vibrant, relational, personal, and important in so many professional and personal ways. So much so that today I was wrestling with something, and at lunch I asked Judge Michel for his advice. And he gave me excellent, sound advice, which makes me know that it is the universe that brings us together when we need each other most. So I want to start with that kind of introduction. And I want to ask Judge Michel, what was his experience as a new attorney entering into the profession, and what experiences did your prior military experience help you in facing this new profession?
Well, I had the good fortune during law school in the third year to have as teachers 4 adjuncts who were based in Washington, D.C., but came to Charlottesville, Virginia, where I was in law school, often teaching over the weekend because, of course, during the week they were doing their government or private law firm work. One of them was a very distinguished civil rights lawyer. If you know the history of civil rights in the middle part of the last century, you would come across his name again and again. His name was David Isbell. And this is an indirect answer, but I'll get around to answering the Dean's thoughtful question, several questions actually. David Isbell told me the best thing you can do when you finish law school is to go try cases. And he said, even if you don't think you want to be a lifetime litigator or you don't know, it's such great training, you ought to do that. And so that was fate or luck, point number one. Point number two was he was a law school classmate of a man named Arlen Specter, who had just been elected at age 35 as a reformed district attorney in the city of Philadelphia, which had suffered quite a lot of political and other corruption for an extended period of time. So I got handed off by David Isbell to Arlen Specter. I interviewed with him. He offered me a job. I took it, and I took it because of the training value and because I believed in him. I had done some research about his background. He had been one of the principal lawyers on the Warren Commission investigating the assassination of President John Kennedy and had been a great corruption investigator in the city of Philadelphia thereafter, and distinguished himself by an investigation that led to the resignation and indictment of almost every magistrate judge in Philadelphia. So again, the evidence of the deep-seated corruption in that city in prior times. He was a taskmaster, but he was a very great teacher. And the other great teacher was the courtroom. In the early years, I went to court every single day and tried cases and handled motions and appeals. So a lot of on-the-job training, a lot of learning by doing, and it was a great experience. And then fate struck once again after Senator Specter had served 2 4-year terms. He was going out of office, and I had run a very big investigation with a 19-month investigative grand jury in the city of Philadelphia as his assistant. So he was out of office. I needed a new career because political fortunes had changed and the new regime was not going to continue any of my investigations or prosecutions. They were covering for the incumbent powers that be. So he called up, and this was the other handoff, he called up Henry Ruth, who was the deputy Watergate special prosecutor under Archibald Cox and later Leon Jaworski. They had taught together at Penn Law School, so again, law school comes back into the picture. So I got handed off to Leon Jaworski. At that point, Professor Cox had returned to Harvard Law School after his tussle with former President Nixon. And it just went on from there. At every turn, I had a chance to intersect with fate and with American history events that seemed to me to be terribly important. And this was very fulfilling to me because it was all for the public good as opposed to private gain, either of myself as a lawyer or of a particular client. Of course, clients deserve to be well represented by lawyers, and that's all well and good. But I had the insight from 4th grade. I had the good luck of stumbling across a biography of Thomas Jefferson in my public school library, which I read, and what came through to me from that was that a lawyer could be in service of the public, not just one client at a time, one company or one individual. And that appealed to me hugely. I can't exactly explain why, but from that young age on, I was very focused on the idea of trying to serve the public, trying to help the whole country, trying to help the justice become more realized in daily life. So I went from the Philadelphia DA's office, lots of big cases, big investigations, indicting city councilmen, investigating the state governor, the police commissioner, and on, to Watergate. And I got assigned to an investigation into a slush fund maintained for former President Nixon by his secretary. You might have heard of her name, Rosemary Woods, and also his personal friend, a banker in Florida by the name of Charles Rebozo, but known as B.B. Rebozo, because they were involved in a payment. This is apparently the style was, if you want to pay somebody in politics, you get $100,000 in 100 dollar bills, and you put them in a briefcase, and you deliver the briefcase to some prearranged person. So the prearranged persons were Rebozo and Woods, and quite a few multimillionaires today, I guess we'd call them billionaires, made such payments. Then Watergate broke out as a public scandal. Before long, President Nixon resigned, so things went on from there, and in the aftermath, he resigned in August of 1974, as you might know, and after that, the grand jury continued its investigation, and so I was assigned to go out to San Clemente, California, to the former Western White House, as the media called it, with the grand jury and a couple other prosecutors to get grand jury testimony from then former President Nixon. So that was another very interesting experience, another intersection with history. And it just went on from there. After Watergate, I went to work for what was known as the Church Committee, the original Intelligence Committee in the U.S. Senate that was investigating misdeeds and illegal or questionable activities by some of our wanted U.S. foreign intelligence agencies, the CIA, the National Security Agency, the IRS, the FBI, and so on. So that was another very interesting experience. Again, it lasted about a year and a half. And then again, luck, fate, however you want to put it, the next step was I went to work in the Justice Department to help organize a new section in the criminal division that would specialize in investigating high-level political corruption all over the country. But as soon as I got there, this is, again, back to the luck and fate, or whichever it is, some information surfaced that allegedly a huge number of members of the U.S. Congress were being paid off under the table by various agents of the Korean government, including Korean Central Intelligence Agencies, real spies, but also some businessmen who were part of a broader scheme to try to influence the U.S. Congress, which was sending lots of money to the Republic of Korea, South Korea, as we sometimes call it. So that blew wide open, and I ended up running another grand jury investigation and having the attention of the highest levels of the Justice Department. And it turned out that the key witness was hiding in Korea, and that America did not have an extradition treaty with Korea at that time. I think there is one now. So I went with the head of the criminal division to visit President Carter in the Oval Office in the White House to try to convince President Carter to put diplomatic pressure on the Korean government to make Park, Tong-sun Park was his name, available as a witness, because there was no way we could either build cases to prosecute guilty congressmen or exonerate any who might be innocent by finding out from the paymaster, if I can call him that, what the true facts were. We had a lot of documents and a lot of background investigation, but he was the primary witness. So I went to Korea twice, once to negotiate with the Korean Justice Ministry to frame a prosecution cooperation agreement, which we finally did after some hard bargaining. Lots of war stories, but we don't have time for all of them, or maybe any of them. So ultimately, Park was deposed for the grand jury by me for 3 weeks in Seoul, Korea in January. If you ever go to Korea, don't go there in January. It's cold as blazes. But that was successful, and then later, with the cooperation of the Korean authorities, Tong-sun Park came back and testified in the grand jury here. And it turned out, happily, I would say, that of several lists comprising, in all, almost 100 members of Congress who were named on lists that had dollar amounts next to their names, that a great many of them actually hadn't received any money at all, that it was sort of padding by the paymaster. Maybe he was pocketing some of the money or somebody else was getting paid. All that remained a bit murky. But anyway, It was a very interesting assignment that lasted 3 years. Again, high energy, high importance, high pressure, high everything, under public scrutiny. Washington Post almost every day for 4 months had a front page story about the corruption in Congress because of Korean payments. So there was a lot of pressure to get it straight, and we did the best we could. And as I say, in the end, a great many congressmen were exonerated, others were indicted, some were unelected, just to put it not too grandly. So in any event, those are just examples of how lucky I was to, every time one chapter was coming to a natural end, something else opened up. And I was very attuned to the idea of timing, that I wanted to keep doing these high profile, high importance public missions, I'll call them, to use a military term. And I was able to do that. Later I worked as one of the supervisors of the FBI and the other law enforcement arms of the huge Department of Justice, and worked to try to make sure that their activities were all lawful but still effective, and tricky balances and procedures had to be worked out to do that. We wrote a statute that would have been like a constitution for the FBI, and in the end it was abandoned as a project, but what was put in its place instead were guidelines issued by the Attorney General that were binding on all the FBI people from top to bottom. And part of the impetus for this was from the church committee from whence I had come, that had unearthed some very ugly facts about some FBI misdeeds, including many focused on Martin Luther King, but also on other people who shouldn't have been under that kind of a microscope. So that became a very interesting job. Now, I had worked for 7 years as an assistant prosecutor in Philadelphia under Arlen Specter, as I mentioned before. Then, during my Washington years, that I've tried to briefly summarize, he was practicing law in Philadelphia. And then he got elected to the Senate in the 1980 election, the election that swept in Ronald Reagan to the White House and other people. Specter had been such a good mentor to me, I felt I owed him a huge debt, in which I did. So he called me up when he got elected, said, I want you to come and help me organize my office and be one of my top assistants. And I had a wonderful job in the Deputy Attorney General's office with a fancy title and doing things like the FBI supervision that I mentioned. So I told him, well, thank you, but it's very flattering, but I don't want to do that because I really enjoy what I'm doing now, and I think it's important, and so on. So he called me 4 times. The 4th time I gave in. He's a very persuasive, forceful man. And I really did owe a huge debt. So I rationalized it by saying, well, I'll come and help you open your office and organize your office, and I'll stay for about 6 months, maybe 7 months at the most. I stayed 7 years. And every day was another blast, high-speed learning. We were working on nuclear arms disarmament treaties. We were working on coal mine safety. We were working on currency rigging by different rival countries, and on and on and on. Every issue of public importance is in front of the Senate every year, thousands of issues. So I got to be Specter's advisor and also a kind of his shadow in a way, because he was very loyal to people who were hardworking. He was the hardest working person I ever met, and the smartest. He had a photographic memory. He never forgot anything. It was amazing. But he was a good teacher and a loyal, good boss. And he talked me into staying longer than my 6 or 7 months, partly by saying, maybe in the end you can get a judgeship. And I'd always wanted to be a judge. I didn't even really know it until he said that. But then I said, yeah, I really would like to be a judge. I love being a prosecutor. I love being a lawyer. I love working in the Justice Department, but I really like to be a judge. And people had told me during the years, first that I should be a lawyer, and then people started saying, someday you should be a judge. I'm not sure why they thought that, but in any event, so I stayed longer, and in the end I did get appointed to the Federal Circuit, as Darrell has kindly pointed out. I served there for 22 years and 2 months and 2 days, and I loved every day of it, and I thought I'd never quit, and I would die in the saddle when I was old and ready to croak. But in 2010, my time as the chief judge, which operates under a formula, was coming to its natural end, because at 70, you're out as the chief judge. You can stay on the court, but your time as chief judge is over and the next person takes over. So that was part of the impetus, was that, it's going to be a different job now. And part of it was I saw what I thought were very, very bad developments in our politics, in our public discourse, in the debates in the media, and in misbehavior by public officials, not only of a corruption sort, but of a stupidity sort, dangerous stupidities. And sitting judges, quite properly, are highly constrained and not allowed to engage in politics or a lot of policy-related things. So I felt I wanted to do that, and in order to do that properly, I had to resign my commission. So in 2010, I resigned my commission, and for nearly 14 years since then, I've pursued 2 lines of work that are still in the same themes as I started out with, almost going back to 4th grade and the Jefferson biography, because I've spent a lot of time trying to help educate policymakers, and particularly in Washington, but also elsewhere, and particularly in the Congress, about intellectual property law and other important things. So that's been one line of work, and then I've been consulting in huge intellectual property cases, mostly involving billions of dollars, if you can imagine, in one case, as a kind of a coach to the lawyers about to argue or brief these cases. So I had the great fortune of one great mentor after another, one fascinating job after another. Needless to say, I didn't make a lot of money. Some lawyers do. My first salary was $5,000 a year as an assistant prosecutor in Philadelphia. It got better over time, but public salaries, for reasons that are quite understandable, are not going to match private salaries in law firms, at least big law firms or corporations. So at the end of my time, I basically had no assets at all. I owned an old car, and I rented an apartment and had some clothes and so on. So I was in a financial hole. So I did the consulting partly to recover financially from the actually 44 straight years of public service, one government job after another after another. And I wouldn't change a day of it. I enjoyed it all. It felt enormously worthwhile and very satisfying. A lot of it was luck. A lot of it was great mentors. A lot of it was good law school training. And a yen to use law for the benefit of everybody, not just to get rich or be famous or whatever. Long answer to the Dean's very pointed
Can I
good
follow
question.
that up?
Yes,
though?
of course, of course.
And I'm channeling my colleagues here who are students, because I would never, in that early time that you started, I would never think about myself being able to impact the world, right? So how did you get the gumption to think I can have this kind of impact, even with that first job out the door? And then, what do you tell yourself in 44 years of public service to remind yourself that this is your raison d'etre? This is your reason for being a lawyer.
Well, it was from the beginning, and it remained that way, and it wasn't too hard despite the limited financial compensation. I was never really tempted to quit. When Specter was in private practice and I was first in Washington, he tried to get me to come and join his law firm, and he tried very hard, and he made sweet offers, and I kept telling him, no, I don't want to give up this public stuff. I'm hooked on the public service stuff. So I did do 44 straight years, and as I say, I wouldn't change a day of it. I loved being a judge, but it was time to take on some new missions, going again back to the military terminology. And, aside from the fact of having that public focus and having all these wonderful mentors, one after another. I once counted them up. I stopped counting when I got to the mid-20s. So over the 44 years, maybe a little bit higher if I add law school years, I had one great mentor after another. Very experienced people, some very famous, all hugely generous with their time. And you think when you're a young person, they're not going to have time to talk to me. They're not going to have time to help me do anything. But one person after another took the time and helped enormously. So I had one personal coach after another over those, particularly the first 22 years, the 22 years on the court. I also had mentors, but they were the colleagues on the bench and the lawyers who appeared in writing and on their feet in the courtroom as well. So it actually wasn't as hard as it maybe should have been. Of course, Dean Conway knows from our own long, distinguished career as a high-level Army officer that if this is what you want to do, this is what you want to do, and this is what you're going to do, and the temptations that snare other people probably aren't too hard to resist. At least it wasn't hard for me to resist, fortunately. I'd hate to think of if I'd given in to any of the temptations to try to get rich and powerful and famous or run for office or anything like that. I really enjoyed the roles that I had, and I'm enjoying the current role enormously. So I've probably answered about 24% of her questions because they were so rich. And I should say we just had a lunch together, which was such a delight. She is an inspiring leader and a fabulously creative, inventive official of a great law school. And she's still serving the country. She's just hooked on public service just like I am. So we're two of a kind, I guess is what I'll say. No wonder I liked her instantly when Darrell introduced us.
Well, on that note, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Lim to ask you about your service on the court.
Thanks, Dean Conway. Actually, I'm going to preface that question by first of all asking you about your Pennsylvania connections. And you're here for the first time at Dickinson Law. You spent the day here. What have been your impressions of both the city, the town that we're in, the school, the people that you've met, and tell us a little bit about your Pennsylvania connection.
Let me start with my impressions when I walked into this building. I immediately got lost, but it was sort of a happy circumstance because I wandered around quite a bit before I decided to bother Professor Lim by calling him on the phone. I was mesmerized by the feel of this place. Part of it's architecture, part of it is the sense of it's not like a factory, it's almost a little bit like a home. The students were enormously polite and friendly and helpful and eager to engage with an old white-haired stranger. So right away I started absorbing the atmosphere of Penn State Dickinson Law School, and I was really intrigued by it. Even some details. Professor Lim showed me the completely honor system cafeteria. I've never heard of a law school that had a totally honor system anything, but especially not if it involves food. So just another example of why this place is so special. The town, of course, is historic. It goes back to the early decades of the existence of our country as a country, and named after a famous founder and founded by another famous founder, Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was a Philadelphian. So I try to answer the other part of Darrell's question. I grew up outside of Philadelphia. I was born in the city. I went to public school all the way through senior high school. I had fabulous teachers, wonderful neighbors and sports coaches and scoutmasters and clerical people and so forth. If you know the paintings and drawings of the artist Norman Rockwell, his paintings are my life story for the first 25 years. That's the kind of life that I had, growing up in a lovely town, very fortunate circumstances. So I had this idea about public service, so right out of law school, I came back to Philadelphia, the city of my birth, because it was a need. A need is a big thing with me. It's connected to the public service thing, but it's not just to serve in the public so you can say you did public things, but it's to respond to acute needs that you see and feel are important and that aren't being well enough met, and then you can maybe try, along with lots of other people, of course, to try to help meet them. And the dean asks about, when you're first starting out, what gives you the gumption to think you can do any of this stuff? I'd never tried a case in my life. I just got out of law school. I just took a bar exam. So they send me to court every day. So I learned by fire, trial by fire. And it was actually a good way to learn. And I had great colleagues who helped, and great bosses, including Specter, but many other people who later became very distinguished lawyers and judges themselves. So Philadelphia had a hold on me. I had been away to college and law school, and returning sort of felt right. And there was a need. And as I say, need is a big deal with me. And responding to needs that are institutional but also human, and that are sort of priority things. One of the things that I had an instinct for, I don't know where it came from, is timing. So for example, when police corruption and police misbehavior became a major public scandal in the early 70s, I got interested in that because it seemed like something that was really important, really new, and needed careful attention and investigation. So the grand jury that I ran from 72 to the beginning of 74 focused heavily on police corruption as well as public official corruption generally, and also on drug trafficking and organized crime. So there was a lot of priorities. But the timing of police corruption being a focus seemed important to me. Then later, of course, the country's in a constitutional crisis with the president being investigated for serious criminal misconduct and his top aides being investigated and indicted. So once again, the idea of an acute need, sort of a moment in history. So when I had the chance to join the Watergate Special Prosecution Force, it was a kind of easy yes. It wouldn't have mattered if there was no pay. I would have done it anyway. And the same thing later with the church committee looking into misdeeds. I got to depose President Nixon, as I mentioned, but in the context of the church committee investigations, I got to depose the former CIA director, Richard Helms. And that was another, great challenge, very exciting, very interesting. And of course, you learn by doing. And so the more you do, the more you learn, and watch other people, and you learn from it everything you can see and hear and read. So I kept trying to do that, trying to be a sponge.
So let me ask you, since Dean Conway teed up the question for me so nicely about your time on the court, what do you think is the most important leadership lesson you have learned in the 22 years you've been on the court, first as judge, circuit judge from 1998 to 2004, and then as chief judge from 2004 to 2010?
Well, I think I learned a lot of patent law, a lot of contract law, a lot of tax law, other specific specialties of the court. I was not steeply schooled in any of them when I began as a judge. I was sort of a former prosecutor who had become something of a generalist in the interim. And when I was, I guess I left out, I mentioned this 14 years with Arnold Specter, but 7 were as his principal aide in the Senate. That was like going to graduate school every year. I learned so much about thousands of different issues and met all sorts of interesting people, and a lot of excitement. Specter took me with him everywhere, as I mentioned, so I traveled around Pennsylvania, I traveled around the country, I met with other senators, I met with President Reagan, as well as Carter, as I mentioned, and the Korea connection. And on foreign trips. I went with Specter and met with President Mubarak in Egypt and Prime Minister Begin in Israel and the Jamal brothers, who were then the leaders in Lebanon, and on and on and on and on, including King Hussein of Jordan and Saudi Prince.
And the Federal Circuit and leadership?
Well, I would connect leadership with fellowship. I tried to be a good follower of the chief judges who preceded me, and I learned a lot about how to be a leader by watching them. Just the way you learn everything from watching other people who are already doing it well. So I had no particular prior training in leadership, but I watched closely and I learned a lot from them. And I again learned by doing. And of course, having really good advice is the best advice I can give any of you. And I had fabulous advice in the persons of Colonel Conway's colleague, Scott McCaleb, from her Army days and his, and also Michael Shanegold, who's here with us today, a very distinguished senior lawyer now in a fabulous big law firm. But Scott and Mike were the chairs of the advisory committee of the predecessor chief judge, and I had the good luck, again, a lot of this is just good luck, good timing. They became the chairs of my 5.5-year tenure as chief judge of the advisory committee. And better even than the committee, they gave me very good advice and were a wonderful sounding board. So having good helpers, good advisors, that's a good way to succeed. And the other thing I learned about leadership is the more apparent power you have, or real power, either one. I only make a distinction because chief judges have more apparent power than real power. You know, they only have one judge, one vote.
Sounds like deanships.
Yeah, exactly. But the more power you have of either type, the more self-discipline you have, the more you have to monitor, edit yourself of everything you say, everything you write, everything you suggest, how you interact with people. And the opposite of throw your weight around or act like a big shot. You have to sort of act like you're their helper. You're trying to enable them all to do their job better. That was kind of the mindset that I had, and it seemed to work very well overall. In hindsight, of course, I can think of some things I could have done better, some bumbles that I maybe could have avoided, but overall it was a very, very good experience. And it really did teach me a lot about leadership. Also, I should add that there were two other levels of the leadership business because I was on the Judicial Conference. That's the governing body of the whole federal judiciary, 26 judges, half trial, half appellate, and chaired by the Chief Justice of the United States. So there was a lot of governance and policy and decision-making and leadership involved there. But even more pointedly, the late Chief Justice William Rehnquist appointed me to the 7-judge executive committee that runs things day by day, week by week, between the twice-a-year meetings of the full conference, which is like a huge board of directors. So I had a lot of leadership training and worked closely with some more experienced leaders. I've learned a lot from them too. So learning by doing is big, learning by observing is big, and you're never done learning. You know, I think when people get out of law school, it's a fairly arduous intellectual experience, and it should be. And you get out and you think, well, now my legal education is done. No, this barely started. This is about the first fifth of your serious legal training. So the first job as a law clerk or at a law firm or in a public defender's office or wherever it is, that's the next stage. And then there's a stage after that and a stage after that. I'm now 83 years old. I'm still learning to write better. Really, every year I can feel I'm a little better than I was before. So it's an endless, which is good that it's endless because it's stimulating and interesting. I'm fully retired, but I work 7 days a week, mostly without pay. So if you love what you're doing, you're going to love doing it.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing because you're the busiest retiree that I know, working 7 days a week.
For free. For free.
Well, part of it's for free, not all of it, no.
Today's is.
Today's is.
Today's
And can I interject just to prove a point? So at lunch, I was asking for Judge Michel's advice, and he gave me his advice. We were talking about his learning from people who were younger than he was, in Mike Shangold and Scott McCaleb, taking advice from younger lawyers.
Yeah, including 48 law clerks that I had over my
Yeah.
22 years on the court. You learn a ton from your law clerks. Not only that, you develop relationships, most of which evolve into close friendships, and they're quite enduring. I had no idea, but it feels like I have this growing army of young, smart, nice people that are like nieces and nephews to me now. So, when people ask, what was the greatest thing about being a federal judge? Was it the big cases, blah, 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 blah. No, the greatest thing about being a federal judge was law clerks.
Right.
It's so much fun. You learn from them, they learn from you. They become family members. It's a fabulous interchange.
Let me ask you a question in relation to that. Since they've got folks in the room, we may be thinking of becoming law clerks. Two-part question: what should they be thinking about in terms of positioning themselves to be a law clerk, and what are some of the traits of the best law clerks that you've had?
Well, I'm a believer in the view that perfecting writing skills is the single most important thing any lawyer can do, no matter what career path you end up pursuing. Nobody writes well enough. Everybody needs to try to write better, clearer, more logically, more succinct, more artfully, more convincingly. You can fill in all the other adverbs. I also think that there are what I'll call farm team possibilities in the legal world. So, for example, law students can get summer jobs, often for some pay, in law firms or public law offices, and they can lead to job offers. They often do lead to job offers. Some judges have law students as interns or externs or whatever the terminology is in the particular locality. That's a foot in the door. That's a start of a relationship. So often those jobs lead to a full clerkship. I think it's important for young lawyers to take advantage of all those kind of farm team type opportunities, and to not worry about what's the salary. The least important thing I would say to you of your first job is the salary. What's the most important thing? The learning rate. How much are you going to learn every day that's going to help you the rest of your life? If the learning rate is high, the salary can be quite low, and it's still a bargain. So be on the lookout for where can I learn the most? Where can I have real mentors? And have fun. Not only learn a mile a minute, but have a great human interchange. But writing skills cannot be overemphasized. I think law students, there's so much law you have to learn that it's impossible for a law school to give you all the writing opportunities that ideally would be there. So when you write on a law review, or you write on a project, or you write a big paper for a professor, or you write for the local newspaper, it's not just legal things. Any kind of writing, it's all interconnected. Good writing is good writing, I think. So look for chances to do more writing, not less. I remember being in law school and looking for chances to do less writing. Dumb. Seek chances to do more writing. And when you're in practice, as busy as you'll be, especially if you're in a sizable law firm, you've got to find a sidelight to do writing. You've got to find a sidelight to represent indigent people, civil or criminal. You'll learn so much from doing that, and you'll do the world some good, which, after all, is why we're here, to help other people. It's getting rich and famous is overrated in our culture, in my opinion.
Thank you. I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'll open it up to the floor for questions or comments. So in addition to the many things you've done, you also serve as the chair of the advisory board of Penn State Dickinson Law's IP and Innovation Initiative. Over the last a couple of years, we have done a number of things. I'll leave you to focus on whichever ones you want, but reflect on your experience in interacting with the Dickinson law community. And a number of those events Dean Conway was also part of, including the Capitol Hill event, as well as the events in New York and in DC, where we had the IP Office of Singapore, as well as a few others. So tell us about what it means to chair the advisory board here.
Well, I had a tryout at Darrell Lim's prior law school as being on the advisory board. And because of untimely death of the longtime chair of that board, I was asked to be the chair. And I had such respect for Professor Lim, whom I had known, not very well, but for some time, that I knew I wanted to say yes. And every time since then, Darrell Lim has asked me to do anything, I've said yes. And if I had to make a prediction, I think I'll keep my record intact. So it was a very unusual experience here in association with Dickinson Law School for maybe three basic reasons. First of all, these two individuals are so innovative and creative and personally compelling that it's a great pleasure to just be around them. You learn, you have fun, you become part of something that's important, something much bigger than yourself, which is, of course, the source of real satisfaction and sustainable satisfaction, as the term bandied about today goes. And the other members of the board, Darrell has built such a network, just the way the dean has. They can call people up all over the country and get people to do stuff, usually for free. It's absolutely amazing.
Superpower.
It's all personal trust, personal connections, relationships that have been developed over time. So the dean and Darrell amassed this board of advisors membership. It's just fabulous. It's like the all-star team in baseball. It's like every great famous lawyer I've ever heard of practically is on this advisory committee. So when they meet, this is like, you know, a PhD program getting ready for the meeting. So again, more learning and great satisfaction, because you work with great people, you'll be a happy person and you'll be a healthy person. So hang around with great people. That's my advice.
Thank you. Questions, comments from the audience? Just raise your hand. Yeah, please identify yourself, name, and if you are a student, 1L, 2L, 3L.
First, thank you so much, Judge Michel, for offering us this such an impactful and inspiring lecture for this year. And my name is Khan, and I'm from South Korea, and I'm a former student of Darrell Lim.
I'm a current student of Darrell Lim.
Thank you. Lots of topic for this lecture, but I just want to say, for first thing, I do agree that the best leader is the best supporter. That's how I feel and how my approach to become a leader, potentially, later on. And then the really, one thing I just want to say is, the 44 years you worked as a public defender, that just makes me to rethink that my genuine purpose for me studying the law in this America. That is, I did want to make some change. And then, to be honest, before that, it was pretty natural for me to just think about getting into big law, getting a high salary, securing my position, and then later on, once I have my own resource, I could think about helping others to make some change. But now, from all the statements and all the things, I feel like I better focus on what actually excites me, what actually stimulates me to move on as a person, as a lawyer. I'm not that lawyer, but so I just want to say, genuinely thank you that you at least changed my venue. That I see my future as I can consider myself as a public defender after this law school year. Thank you so much.
Well, fortunately, there are many different pathways for serving the public. Many lawyers go into private practice, and then at some point in their career, go into the government for some appointed position or elective position, and then perhaps after a few years go back to private practice. Some people in private practice serve on advisory boards for government officials, and in that way help things get better. I like the word change that you use. If you're trying to make a change, in your case back home in South Korea, I think that's good. But I have a slightly different word that comes to mind, which is improvements. Just change isn't necessarily better, but change that works in improvement is really important. That's what we should all be about in every job, in every line of work, in every profession, because number one, there's a lot of need out there, and number two, it's satisfying. You'll be happy with yourself. You'll be glad you're doing what you're doing. It's a very thoughtful question. I hope you don't close your mind completely to other options, but I'm very gratified to hear that you would at least consider a public career. I have loved every day of my career, and I'm still loving it. And as I say, an awful lot of good luck and good mentoring went into it. But the idea of somehow using your legal skills for the benefit of your state, your country, your society, something that should be in your mind all the way through your whole career. There are different ways to do it.
Thanks. Do we have another question or comment? Yes.
So one question I have is
Name and
Sorry.
identify which year you're in.
absolutely. So my name's Jake McGuire. I'm a 1L. So my question for you is I'd love to kind of hear about how you've learned from colleagues on the federal circuit. So a funny story that I have is that my first roommate at Dartmouth, his name was Chris Palacios, and he's a soccer player there. He later played soccer for Penn State, but he told me that his grandfather is Judge Timothy Dick on the federal circuit. So I guess I was wondering kind of what your experiences learning from colleagues on the court have been like.
Yeah, the colleagues on the court, like earlier mentors, were enormously generous to help a rookie judge, I'll call myself, learn the game, learn how to be an appellate judge in my case, or a trial judge in other people's cases. Some of it was informal conversations, maybe over lunch or sitting around a table in an office. And a lot of it was by reading their comments on opinions that I was drafting. And when you circulate a proposed opinion for a panel that you've served on, of course, the other judges on the panel scrutinize the draft and make comments and make suggestions or complain or whatever. And that interchange is very educational, and it's a very good system. Trial judges operate as solo performers. They're the only one in the courtroom. They're the king of that room, that case, which is good for efficiency. But appellate judging is, I'll call it committee work. There are always at least two other people. So you have to work cooperatively. You have to come to a result that you can all be comfortable with and proud of, and feel that it's the right result and it's going to be beneficial. One thing that I've learned in hindsight, long after leaving the court, is how little I understood about economics, business decision-making, the importance of investment of money. You're talking about innovation. Everybody's for innovation. But some people act like it just happens like apples fall from the tree. And that's the opposite of reality. The reality is it takes not only very talented scientists and engineers and other specialists, but it takes a ton of money, ongoing investment, maybe by venture capitalists, maybe by corporate officials. So then the question is, well, what's going to protect that investment if it's made? And if there's no protection, will it just not get made at all? I had very dim understanding of that whole realm of business, economics, investments, decision-making by people who manage money. And in hindsight, I think that's a big weakness of many judges. I was not the only judge who was less than fully sophisticated in those realms. And just in general, law is a great training because it makes you think logically, and it's a great learning experience because you learn from every case. Whatever your role in the case is, you learn from every situation. But the thing that sort of jumps out at me is that our world has become specialized, the legal world and every other part of the world seemingly, which is necessary. But if we live in intellectual silos, that's bad. That's going to hurt the quality of the results. So if judges understand a lot about the law, but almost nothing about economics, the results are not going to be good enough. So my advice to all of you would be to try to be sure you have broad foundational learning. I can almost not think of an undergraduate course that would not be useful, whether it's psychology or philosophy or economics or any number of things, science, and so on. So the broader your perspectives, the more ably you're going to be able to navigate a career. And not only know about local things in your city or your state or your region, but global things, because now so much of the world, and not just the business world, every aspect of the world is heavily global. So you need to know a lot about things in a lot of different places. So breadth of knowledge turns out to be a big deal. Silos are bad, bad, bad.
And what you're saying too is that listening to your colleagues can help you learn. Having an open mind can help you learn. Finding knowledge in things that you may not expect to be relevant is learning.
That's a very good point, Dean, because lots of things that seem important turn out to be less important than they seemed, and other things that weren't even in your mind turn out to be very important. And a great source of learning about those unidentified important things is from listening to colleagues and opponents in cases, and so judges learn a lot. Some people think judges know everything. Judges are just old lawyers. They have their strengths and they have their weaknesses, but they aren't all wise beings descended from heaven or something. They're just lawyers who now have a very high responsibility to try to make the law move forward in a just and reasonable way that's beneficial to society. That's the whole point of law and of courts.
We have a question.
So open-minded is a really key point.
Over there, yeah.
Hi, my name is Ina Spider. I'm also 1L and former student of Professor Lin. My question is, during your career, what has been the most influential change in IP law you've seen?
I would say the intervention by the Supreme Court in the last almost 18 years on fundamental tenets of patent law, but also copyright law, but particularly patent law, has been very, very influential, and to my eye, poorly thought out and not very constructive. And now it's created a dilemma, you could almost say a trap, because all of the courts below the Supreme Court must follow the Supreme Court precedent, because it's a hierarchical system where precedent is king, and it has to be that way. But it's unfortunate because if the Supreme Court decision is net harmful, which I think a series of the decisions are, then you're in the trap. What's the exit from the trap? The Congress. Patent law is statutory law for the most part. Contract law has great statutory parts of it. Same with copyright law and other areas. So courts have to function better by being better equipped to understand all the implications of their decisions and their opinions. But the legislators need to become functional again for a lot of different reasons. And you can see it in the papers every day, the state legislature, the Congress, the city council, just about everywhere. There's paralysis, there's quarreling, there's a lack of being open-minded, learning from one another, trying to make things better, change for that are improvements. So the legislature is now the weak link in the chain because it's become so combative and partisan and dysfunctional. So I'm spending most of my retirement trying to educate congressional staffers and members of Congress and people who influence them, like editorial writers and other think tank people and so on. We need to have all three branches functioning effectively, well-informed, in their respective zones, but also in a coordinated fashion. And we don't have that today. So we have a lot of work to do on the public side of our governance structure to make it work for the benefit of people. That's why it exists. It's not supposed to make politicians garner headlines. It's supposed to help people with their daily life. So and lawyers have a big role in that, not just retired judges, but all lawyers have a big role in that. And the Congress has been sort of neglected by our society, including our legal culture, and I hope that that will change. I'm doing my little bit to try to help with that.
A tremendous bit.
Yeah, another
Including
question.
being
I could
here.
see the question on your face when you were.
All right, one more question,
One
and then
last
I'm
question.
going to hand the time over back to you.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you for coming, Judge. My name is Stephen LaValle. I'm a 1L. And I was wondering if either of them, who was more intimidating, Nixon or Helms? And did working for as an assistant district attorney prepare you for those major prosecutions?
Well, everything gives you some preparation. You're never quite totally ready for whatever the challenge is that comes up, but let's say you're half ready. And sure, yeah, going to court every day for years and all kind of civil and criminal cases, trial and appeals was good training. And running a lot of big investigations was good training to run later big investigations. I think that the word that comes to my mind is growth or development. You want to keep developing yourself for the next challenge, even if you don't quite know what the next challenge may be. That's why it bothers me so much that people think when they finish school and they leave a building like this beautiful building that they're done. They're not done. As they say, it's really just the beginning. So you have to be a lifelong student, curious your whole life, learning every day. Whatever it seems like you need to learn or want to learn, that's your number one mission. Keep learning.
And who was more imposing, Helms or Nixon?
I wasn't trying to duck the question. I just forgot it.
I thought it was a great question.
Actually, Director Helms was a more difficult witness because he was steeped in the tradition of CIA from days of old. It's not true now. That if necessary, whatever that would mean, it's okay to lie, even if you're in a congressional hearing or in a deposition by a correct congressional investigator. So that was one challenge. Second thing is he's an extremely smart man, and he's very analytical, and therefore he knows what the next question is going to be, and the question after that is like the great chess masters. They're thinking 16 moves ahead and so on. So that made him, in a way, a more difficult witness because he was, I'll say, slippery and extremely smart. Former President Nixon was a completely different challenge. As you could maybe imagine, he resigned in disgrace. He might have been indicted and convicted and imprisoned if he hadn't resigned. We will never know. But of course, he was later pardoned by President Ford, so that's why it didn't happen. That was the decisive reason it didn't happen. But he was a tortured personality. And I saw in the course of maybe 2.5 hours of examination, 3 totally different people. The same face, the same suit, the same necktie, totally different people. He just kind of veered in and out of one persona and another. At times he was angry, he was scolding, he was uncooperative, he was grumpy, fussy. At other times he was charming, personable. At one point he complained that all the special prosecutors were all liberal Democrats, which actually wasn't true. But he was very bitter about that. And at another point during a break, he came out and started chatting with the prosecutors in a very friendly way, like he was, he was one of their colleagues. It was like, wow, this is the same guy who was screaming at us before that we were all a bunch of political hatchet men. So a very strange experience to question Nixon. Also a very smart man, no question about it, but with a personality that had been twisted by circumstance, I guess you might say. So very different challenges with the two of them. But I learned from every witness I ever questioned, in grand jury investigations, in trial courts. I learned from every opponent. I learned from every colleague. The help was there. It's all around you every day. If you have the hunger for it, if you have the eye, what can I learn from this person or this case or this event? So be on the lookout.
What a great way to conclude this discussion. You are a constant source of wisdom, of empathy, of care, of compassion, of intelligence. And I, for one, am grateful that I am in your sphere.
I'm grateful I'm in your sphere,
Thank
literally and figuratively.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.